Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Stacey Harris, who is a General Superintendent at Consigli Construction Company. To say that Stacey could be an ambassador for the construction industry would be to sell her enthusiasm and passion for her work short. I could have talked to Stacey for hours about her projects and what she loves about her work. We didn't quite take that much time, but we did talk about how she found the right path in the field of civil engineering. And hearing about that was really interesting and a good reminder that even when you do know what you want to do, sometimes it can take a little bit of time to find the way to do it. Our conversation was recorded in October 2024. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Today's episode of the Maine Science Podcast is brought to you by Bangor Savings Bank, committed to supporting scientific exploration and discovery in Maine. Stacey, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I really appreciate you being here. I especially appreciate you going a little outside your comfort zone with my freewheeling ways of talking to people and not giving you a whole list of what we're going to cover. Part of that is because I like to see what comes up in the conversation. The general theme for longtime listeners, they'll know this, is how did you get into science and engineering, right? And I think one of the coolest things that I've been learning is everybody's path is different. And very few people are fortunate enough to know at the age of 2 what they want to do, or 3, or, if you're my son, 1.5. But besides that, the rest of us are figuring it out as we go along. So you're a construction engineer, which is, to put it mildly, not a woman-dominated field. So I'm curious kind of how you got there, and then we'll talk about your current work.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, definitely a little bit out of the comfort zone, but I appreciate you hyping it up and giving me the boost to do it. Also, a little bit about noise. I am actively on a job site. So if you start hearing power tools or whatnot, this is sort of the life that we live. It's a little bit different, but a little bit about how I got here. I would say the theme of how I got here was a lot of advisors and mentors and a lot of talking about things that I didn't, and then sort of understanding passion. So knowing now and looking back on my journey, was always an engineer from birth. I would sort things. I loved patterns. I loved having everything in a row. I loved math and science. I just like to take problems and organize them and problem solve. I would take toys apart and put them back together. I was obsessed with Legos. Obsessed. Still am to this day. So my husband always knows what to get me for Christmas. Just a Lego set, big set. But not everybody around me knew that those were traits of an engineer. I remember being in school, loving math and science. And there was a recruiter for colleges that came in and took all the women that loved math and science and said, there's this thing called engineering that you can do your love for math and science and get paid to do that. And when they originally said engineer, I thought it was the driver of a train, like an engineer on a train. So that was just how little exposure. Everyone in my family were educators, and thank goodness for that. Just wasn't my path on being a math teacher, but I would not have been where I am today without excellent math and science teachers. So shout out to them. I could not do what you do. So I was guided to engineering based on other people recognizing what my passions were, because I didn't see it in anybody who I lived with or friends with. So I went into UMaine, the University of Maine. Shout out to them, go Black Bears. They have a wonderful program that was engineering undecided. So then they would walk freshmen through each discipline of engineering. And that was my only exposure to what engineering was. And it was excellent. And I remember the professor coming in when it was time for civil engineering and said, "Do you love Legos?" And I perked up and said, "That certainly is me." Said, "Civil engineering is Legos for big kids." And I was sold right there and knew that that was going to be sort of the discipline of engineering for me. So I went through all 4 years. I had an excellent advisor. I job shadowed. I interned to actively see what people do, because I was still struggling what I was going to do after. And I spent a lot of time saying, this just isn't quite right. This isn't that Legos for big kids that I thought engineering was. And I spent a lot of time with my advisor explaining that. And he said, well, you're really good at talking with engineers and understanding business and leadership, being a liaison between those two. Does that seem more of your interest? And I said, yeah, that seems better. So I went and got my MBA, and I went to study in Rome and Shanghai. I would love to talk about that someday, a whole nother podcast, right? And then came back and talked to an advisor again and said, the full business size just isn't right either. And there was this beautiful building on the RPI campus when I was getting my master's that looked like a ship in a bottle. And I said, I want to build things like that. And that's when the advisor said, hey, that was a company that's going to be at the career fair in 2 weeks. Go talk to them about what that job was going to be like. So did the same thing, went in, asked a lot of questions, knew what I didn't like. And then this quest where I want to do Legos for big kids. And that was construction. And I got hired into that job. I walked on the job site. I saw the cranes. I saw the equipment. I saw steel coming and getting put together. And I said, this is my home. And it felt right. But it took a lot of job shadowing, internships, talking to advisors, talking to mentors, and kept getting guided until I found my home, which was construction.
I have so many comments. So I noticed that you went to RPI. That's where I did my undergrad. Actually, I did my master's degree there too. But it's really remarkable that you had someone come to you in high school and explain what engineering was. I was a sophomore at RPI before I knew what engineers did because I was studying science. And I realized that all the people that I knew who were in engineering had someone in their family who was an engineer. So that's kind of how they knew about it. Because I remember thinking like, engineering stuff's kind of cool. Like, I love the science too, but it was this whole other path that just wasn't explained. I mean, I'm enough older than you that it just wasn't explained unless you knew someone who knew someone as opposed to an actual path.
Yeah, that's what's so great about things like this podcast, where there isn't somebody in your family, because that's the same way for all the engineers I went to school with. There was somebody in their family that was an engineer, or they had a family friend that was an engineer, and that was their exposure. So you really kind of got to get introduced to the field. And yes, I was lucky. They still do that program to this day. And hopefully something like this podcast too can resonate and share the love of engineering, because it is a great field.
And I really like how you talked about, civil engineering is really broad, right? Like, so getting it introduced as Legos, but for mostly uninitiated like me, right? It's bridge building, it's road building, it's building buildings. There's all sorts, and then there's pieces within that. So I can imagine there was a level of frustration for you thinking I'm in the right spot, but it's not the right spot. And how do I get to the right spot? Like, that is a serious amount of perseverance to figure out how to get there.
The exact moment is actually very funny. I was in my soils lab, and man, do people love soils labs. I was sitting there analyzing different dirt and how wastewater can go through. And I'm looking at the dirt and I'm like, I'm not sure I can do this for the rest of my career. That was the story. I went to my advisors, and he said the same thing. He's like, there's so many disciplines of structural, environmental, and wastewater and transportation and all that. So I was like, okay, thank goodness. But really listening to that inner voice of like, this isn't the right fit. It's close, but it's just not the right fit. Now I just move big things of dirt around with equipment, and that's what I love.
I mean, how awesome is that? I'm like, that would be so cool. So I'm going to actually ask you very quickly about China and Rome. Was that part of your MBA work, or was that just an add-on that you got to do? And was it engineering related, or was it business related?
It was engineering and business related. I grew up in Maine. I loved Maine. I went to school, right in my backyard. I had regrets of when I graduated saying, I want to see what else has to offer in the world. So I was really looking for a master's program that had a sort of traveling component. And RPI had the Global Enterprise Management MBA, which is a really fancy word for it. You get to just study how business is done, but it's RPI. So there's always that engineering twist to it. So it was a partnership with IBM. So we got to go see what IBM was doing and how they did business everywhere. And then as I travel, obviously looking at the architecture and how it was built, I would show up onto construction sites and say, okay, how does this work here? So yeah, we did, as part of the summer, as soon as I graduated, we went and did a few weeks in Rome and then did a few weeks in Shanghai. And the drastic business, the ways that business is conducted and way engineering is conducted in those two places was sort of an immersive experience. It was fantastic.
How did those places compare to the US for those things? For when you said how engineering is conducted, what does that mean?
Soils isn't my passion, but I'll start from the foundation up of even geography of snow, wind, earthquake, your decisions that you make in the built environment based on where you are physically was a lot different. Politics come into it and be able to get permitting and how things are developed, in some place like China is much different than here on how permits can go and how buildings are done. their needs, population growth, completely different in China. And so they need a lot more prefabrication, and buildings need to go up in 8 months instead of 2 years. And so they're very innovative on how they can assemble and get people homes quickly. There's a lot of practices that we can use here. So there's a lot of different challenges. And on the business side, especially being a woman, I spent a lot of time understanding how business is done differently. And, I'm a very bubbly, happy, come into the room and let's talk about problems and solve. That can be very off-put into some cultures. And it's not right to just come in and be like, well, you've got to do it the American way, because that's how we do it. It's how do we meet each other halfway? And first, spending the time to research that culture and understand. And then that time that you put in, people will respect that and say, okay, I respect your culture, you respect mine. How can business be done with people meeting halfway? That's not always done and can be challenging. And that's why they have entire master's degrees on global enterprise management and understanding business globally, because it is different.
That's really cool. I'm not at all surprised about the engineering aspect of it. You could make the same arguments geographically within the US too, some of the different cultures and geographic situations, right? Like the recent hurricane is proof enough. Like you have to build differently there than you have to in Maine, where there's a lot of cold weather, right? Your approach has to be different based on that. All right. So let's dive into what you do now. You get to build buildings, and they are not like residential buildings. I know you mentioned housing. So what is it that you're doing at Consigli?
So we spend a lot of time taking the projects that not everybody wants. The heart of the project will take that on. So we do a lot of active hospital work. You can't shut down a hospital to add things onto that. We do a lot of academic work, which is you have a short window once the students are gone to get things done. We do life science and serve a lot of our scientists out there that are doing some fantastic things in the state of Maine. But to build a lab is much different than to build a performance arts venue for a college. So we diversify a little bit there, but they're always complex. They're always challenging, and then change the landscape from, a beautification standpoint. There's some of the most beautiful buildings in the state. So that's the ones that we go after.
You don't have to answer this if it makes you feel like you're choosing between your children. Do you have a favorite project? And you can answer in multiple ways. Do you have a favorite project based on, how about this? How about the complexities that you had to solve? Do you have a favorite project that might fall in that because of just the end result and how beautiful it is? And do you have a favorite project for what may have been like an intertwining of all these different interests into this one piece?
I would say the first thing that came to mind, the job I first built in Maine. So I did the boomerang thing. I traveled the world. I built in Boston. And then my love for Maine was still there. And I came back, and knowing the more I traveled, the more I loved our state. And so I came back to raise my family here. But the first build that I had coming back to the state will always have a special place in my heart, because a little bit silly me, traveling the world and seeing all these, I was like, I'm going to have to come back and, build warehouses or Walmarts, and all of these things are important. I just grew up building laboratories and high rises, and I never knew about all of that work was happening in Maine. We could do a better job marketing that we do those things. So I came back and did a pharmaceutical grade lab for ImmuCell, and the fantastic company that helps cows with mastitis. Is a $2 billion market loss when cows are out because they're sick. I got to build that facility, and I got to use my expertise that I learned in Boston and then bring it back. So that project means a lot to me because it allowed me to come back to the state that I love and use my knowledge. So that is one that stands out, certainly. Being able to go back to the University of Maine, that also meant a lot to me, and build the engineering building. So thank you for the education. Thank you for the degree. Now I get to come back and use that degree and give back to the campus. That one was very special to be able to say that. They also had a time capsule. I often would bring my son up, and the two of us were on site, and I would take photos of that. They put that in the time capsule. So when my son is 50, he's going to be able to come back and be able to see that. So that was pretty cool to be able to say, my son has a piece forever in that building. So that's another one that is special to me because it kind of seemed like a life cycle, full cycle. And then I would say just recently we finished up a performance arts building on the Colby campus, and to be able to take some of the architectural elements and then take the technical elements, because acoustics obviously map in that, and to make it beautiful and to make it technical, the amount of mechanical systems that can't vibrate, that can't make noise, even the struts that hold up these beautiful, millwork pieces that we have, was very challenging. And you have to do that with all the seats in the middle and be able to get the workers there safely. That was the recent challenge that I thought was fantastic. And you stand outside that building and look, it's not a square building. They're easy. It just showcased the challenges that we had there. And currently, right now, I'm in the basement of a courthouse, and we are actively replacing the HVAC system while the courts are still in session. And we take each piece by piece, and putting it together in multiple phases without disruptions to the federal court. You really can't mess that up. So I wouldn't say this is so beautiful. Beautiful is different for different people, right? And this is a very challenging job, working with the courts to be able to get what they need and be able to get what we need and be good neighbors. So I would say that was the one is very interesting for me right now.
So your title is General Superintendent, and it sounds to me like you're doing a lot of managing of how to get these things done, but you have to understand the entire structure and all the pieces that go along with it. So could you step me through, what does a week on a job site look for you? If you want, pick any one of those 3 projects that you just mentioned and just kind of step us through, because it sounds to me like not every day is the same. I'm going to say not every hour is the same. And you do get to, I assume, move around dirt occasionally, but it sounds like you've got a whole lot more going on. So what does that mean? And I'm going to conjecture, do a little guesswork here, but I'm thinking your civil engineering background and the work that you did first at a school combined with your MBA all come into play with what you have to do on an hourly basis.
Yeah, certainly. So I can walk you a little bit about a day in the life of a super, because each one of those jobs were at different phases of my career. So when you come in first into the field operations in that superintendent role in construction, you are the person that shows up, opens the gates, welcomes all the workers on site, and you're the last one to close the gates. So you are responsible for everybody's safety. You are responsible for the schedule. You are responsible for every material delivery truck that comes in to make sure that material is right and installed in the right way and the quality of the job. So you are the leader for all of either our self-perform workers or the subcontractors that you work with. And the day-to-day flow and management sometimes can be up to 150 workers on site. So that was my role on the ImmuCell project. I was the one managing all of the workers on that project. The next step that, within our company is senior superintendent, and which you will manage a couple of sites at one time. And you spend a lot more time managing the superintendents or assistant superintendents that you work with. And then the next up is general superintendent. And in Maine, I manage the state of Maine and sometimes parts of New Hampshire. And I manage our self-perform group. So at any time, we could have 15 to 17 projects. Right now, we have our superintendent staff. Like I talked about, the person that's opening and closing the gate, we have about 35. And then the self-perform, it will fluctuate. But right now, we have about 60 carpenters, laborers, and masons that work with our crew, share the same hard hat, and they're the ones doing the work. And then the subcontractors on any job, we could hire, 7 to 40 different subcontractors in each one of those jobs. So, that's thousands and thousands of people. So my job is management of the field operations, all of the projects, all of our self-perform, and all of the superintendents.
Sorry, I'm just trying to think about how tired I would be right now if I...
A day in the life of a general superintendent, I spend a lot of time in my big red Consigli truck. I'm a road warrior. I start the morning off with my boys. I just recently had my second child in July, so I make sure I get my mom time in and get them off to school and give them their hugs and kisses and make sure they're good, because that's the number one job I've got. And then I spend time making sure that I try to do 3 hard things a day and start with the hardest things first. So I'll look to are there any fire drills, or is there anything on fire? When we had the hurricanes come in, our job sites get hammered. So I need to make sure everybody's safe, can get to the job site safe, checking in with those superintendents. So I start the day off planning the day, and then I try to hit 2 to 3 jobs a day. And I'll walk onto the site, and always with the mindset of, is everyone going to come onto site and leave in the same condition that they were? These are workers and families, and people need these people home. So safety is obviously the first lens that I work in, and I make sure schedules are what they need. make sure that the clients are being heard. Are they enjoying the journey of their build? There's a lot of great contractors out there that can build you great buildings. We really make sure, are you going to enjoy this journey? Because sometimes we can be with you for 3 to 4 years. So we check in with the clients, making sure that they have what they need, and then really checking in with the team. What obstacles do they have? What do they need? And I try to do that with 2 to 3 jobs a day. Somewhere on 95, you'll see a Consigli truck, and that's me heading up and down through all the sites.
That's awesome. We haven't talked about what feels like a little bit of an elephant in the room, just based on my experience of being in college in the late 80s and early 90s and the proportion of women in engineering in general and civil in particular. So I feel like we at least have to address it, or else I haven't done whatever my job is here that I've assigned myself to. I'd like to think it's not an issue like it used to be. It was definitely an issue being the outsider in the room. It seems to me, from talking to you, not just here, but other times, and seeing how it works, like the biggest issue with women in engineering is just that there aren't enough of them. And you could say that about people going into engineering at all. It's not as much of there's no women in engineering. It's just we need young people pursuing it. And maybe I'm putting too rosy a face on it, but what has your experience been with that?
Yeah, everybody's experience is completely different, but I'm happy to share because I think the stories are important, because if it does resonate with one person or exposure to one person, that matters. Every person matters. It's better, but it's not where we need to be. The minute that you don't have to ask me that question, because there are so many women in engineering, that's my line of success. So we're not there. We still have a lot of work to do. I've seen a lot of growth in my 10 plus years in the industry thus far. When I started at the University of Maine, I never felt like a woman engineer. I just felt like an engineer. I think our discipline at the time had the most women. And we had Society of Women Engineers, which was great. And I got to meet other people, but there was enough women who are still very good friends of mine to this day. In the class, it never felt like it needed to be highlighted or you were just another person in class.
So you didn't have the experience that I often had where I was the only woman in the classroom.
The minute I stepped out of college and went to my first construction site for my first job, I was the only woman. Again, a little oblivious to the whole thing. It was often a lot of people asking me the question, oh, you're the only woman here. And I was like, well, I'm just here to get a paycheck. And I spent a lot of time answering questions for people because they were seeing it. So it made me say, okay, why do people keep asking me this question? But then I'd look around the room and like, oh, yeah, okay, I guess I am the only one here. And that's when I realized that there were a lot of women in the industry, was people pointing it out. I never sort of let that bother me and would answer a lot of those questions because people really were curious. But what I realized is I superintendent different than my peer superintendents. Because I'm a woman, I come with different experiences. I come with different life experience. And so we always go to the finish line of the building is going to get done, but the way I get there will look different than my peers. And that's okay. And so I kind of own that a little bit as a superpower of mine. I was the first superintendent that Consigli had at the time. So it was me. Now, 10 years later, we have women's field ops retreats where we bring all of the women together because we have so many women in field ops that we can talk about our experiences. There isn't just, a phone call to myself. There is a plethora of women who are now in field operations, and that's amazing. And this year, we actually struggled putting the retreat together because there were so many people that we couldn't fit in a hotel, multiple hotels or locations. So we're trying to now figure out, what a wonderful problem to have. There's so many women in the construction.
That is really nice.
And that even translates to the trades. I very rarely saw women in the trades. And this is the people who actually matter, the people with the tools who are putting the building together. And now I can say just about every job site will have at least one woman. And being the only woman in the room, yes, I experienced that in my career, still do to this day. I want to share a story that was shared with me. We had a project at the YWCA, and we had a female executive, a female PM, a female superintendent, a female project engineer, and a female assistant superintendent. And they walked into the room, they won that job, and they started to build the job. They were sitting in an owner's meeting, and everybody on the board was women as well. They brought in an engineer for the mechanical engineering side, and he was a man. And he walked into the room and he stopped. He froze and he said, "I'm the only man in the room." And it kind of just announced it. And the project executive on that job, she's like, "Welcome to our careers. Often we're the only ones in the room too." So remember that feeling. And they had the best laugh. And I loved that story of somebody realizing like, oh, this is sometimes somebody's experience of being the only one in the room. And I just loved that moment happened with some good friends of mine. And it just makes me laugh because like we're getting there. We certainly are, but we still have some work to do.
Yeah, I do think we're getting there. And, I think much like you, I thought I was like a female chemist, but it was hard not to notice sometimes just because the percentages were so vast. And the thing I like most seeing is, well, first of all, my children are adults now, and we talk about some of these things that we experience, and they look at us like, that happened like 2,000 years ago, right? That can't possibly be true. For them, the mindset is very different. And that's what it feels like we're getting there. So my expectation is that when we do a check-in, Stacey, in 5 years, this conversation is not going to include it because we're going to have hit the point where that's not something that needs to be addressed. And I will tell you, one of the reasons I thought of it is we did a pilot camp this year where it was called Girls Build the Future. And it was introducing middle school girls to construction engineering. And, it was entirely because there aren't a lot of women in the field. And there's a lot of work that's been shown that if you don't tell girls what's possible, actually in elementary school, but at least by middle school, then they're not even going to know, right? And I love letting people know that engineering exists as a field, but also to let girls know, like, these are all the things that you can do. I think boys need it too, but I think girls don't hear about it outside of specific attempts to help them hear about it. So that's the part I'm hoping we're getting past.
I agree. And thank you for doing programs like that because it matters. I wish I would have had that program in middle school because I was this girl playing with Legos and playing my grandfather's wood shops and pulling radios apart and putting them back together and building forts. And I did it all in, my Disney princess dress, as I do love to sparkle, covered in dirt. But nobody looked at this sparkly princess that was playing in the dirt and building and saying, oh, she's going to be great in construction. I was pushed a lot into, you got to do math, be a math teacher. And we'll know we're there when we see these young women engineers displaying these engineering natural skill sets. And we're going to be able to look at her and say, you are going to be building the next city. You are going to be an architect or an engineer or a construction manager. You are showing these skills and this is your passion. Let's get you out on the construction site. The minute we can get a lot of people recognizing that those women are out there, because they are, they're just getting pushed into these traditional roles. So that's why podcasts like this matter. These programs that you were talking about matter because they're out there. They just need somebody to recognize them and say, hey, this is a job where you can get paid to do what you love.
So the other thing that matters is to have really good ambassadors and people who can speak to what they're doing and why they love it. And that is completely taken up by people like you. So I am so grateful, first of all, that you carved time for me for this in the midst of your job site. And secondly, that you are willing to be kind of this ambassador and this leader in the forefront of talking about both your experience and what we can do when we recognize kids' potential, regardless of what it is. So I do appreciate that.
Well, thank you for advocating and sharing engineer stories. It's a wonderful field and brings a lot of joy and changes our landscape and makes our cities better and makes our lives better. So we need more women engineers out there. So let's get them.
All right. I can't think of a better way to end. We're going to just leave that there. And
awesome. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.